think that the single most important thing
Yeah.
is role models.
Role models.
If high school students, if university students look at successful entrepreneurs, and I don't mean like the Mikitani sons or the Son sons, those are like too successful. I mean people who are maybe 5-10 years older than they are, who've been successful overseas, who've had that experience. So they're more role models.
Yeah.
And then we can say, hey, well, look at these people.
Right.
And someone like that, a university student, a high school student, is more like say, oh, well, they're kind of like me, right? They're just a little bit further along. I can do that.
Right.
And if I had to pick one thing that would help change minds, I think it is role models.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to JStories, where we discuss startups and innovation, and especially the solutions that they offer to global social and environmental challenges facing our world today. And our special guest today is one and only Tim Romero, who needs no introduction in Japan's international startup community.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And what a career you've had so far. And I love your autobiography on your disruptingjapan.com website. For those of you in the audience who may not be familiar with Tim and his or the international startup community in Japan, Tim is a serial entrepreneur and the founder of Disrupting Japan podcast, startup podcast. And you've been interviewed how many? Hundreds of Japanese startup entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
200.
Over
200 startup entrepreneurs based in Japan. And you also know not just the startup community in Japan, but the big tech, corporate, big company scene inside out. Now you're ahead of Google, the head of Google for startups in Japan.
I've had a lot of, I spent a good part of my career jumping between startups and large corporations. So yeah.
It's amazing.
And the autobiography and myself, I consider to be works in progress. I update it every year.
So yeah, for those of you in the audience, I highly recommend reading Tim's autobiography on his website, disruptingjapan.com. It just tells his whole story of transitioning from physics major to a professional musician, and even at some point you were a wholesale buyer.
I was buying cowboy boots.
Right.
I've had a variety of careers, let's put it that way.
Yeah. And landing in Japan, became a serial entrepreneur, and now heading Google startup team in Tokyo. So Tim, I've got a bunch of questions for you, and then I really love to hear your thoughts and opinions on Japan startup scene, especially the potential and challenges, and how we could build, the kind of ecosystem that could help Japanese startups so that they can grow and shine on a world stage.
All right.
So, yeah,
that's a big question. So where do you want to start getting into this?
Okay, let's begin looking at the potential first. In terms of the number of unicorns, for example, the number of unicorns in Japan is pretty small, like just about 10, I think, as of now, compared to much bigger numbers in the US or China. That said, I think you have high hopes for Japanese startups. And where do you see big potential for Japanese startups for them to be able to grow and shine on the world stage, particularly in which fields do you see their potential?
Yeah, let's before we talk about particular fields and sectors, let's talk about unicorns, because I think people put a little too much emphasis on unicorn counting.
Okay.
So, I mean, it is important, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
so I think one of the reasons that we don't see as many unicorns in Japan as we do in comparable markets or even in smaller markets
Yes.
is that historically Japan's VC industry has been set up to have a safe, steady stream of low value IPOs.
Mm.
That's just how the industry was structured. Founders were pressured into IPOing early.
Mhm.
Um, Now we've had a number of startups recently and during the dot-com era that IPO'd well below $1 billion in valuation, but quickly grew well beyond that. That had those
Right.
companies been in the US, they would have stayed private longer.
Mhm.
What we're seeing now is largely due to more foreign capital coming into the market. Um, Founders have more options. There's more, it's easier to raise money to continue to grow. And so Japanese startups are staying private longer. And so we should see more unicorns. Um, so I think, I mean, you have to remember though, unicorns,
Mm.
it's a measure of value creation.
Right.
Right? It's creating valuable businesses that are contributing to economic growth.
Yeah.
Um, so I do think both the foreign money coming into Japan and the fact that Japanese VCs are
Mhm.
raising much bigger rounds means they have to
Right.
write bigger checks. They have to
Mhm.
deploy more money, and that can only happen at like growth stage. So I think in the
I
coming
see.
5 to 10 years, we're going to see Japanese startups staying private longer and
Mhm.
hopefully see a lot more unicorns coming out of Japan.
That's good news. Compared to like startups in, for example, US, where you're from, and there's a lot of, I'm sure, differences here. And
Mm.
then, like, what do you think is particularly unique to, the Japanese startup scene compared to, the startup ecosystem in other countries?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that's most unique in Japan is the level of collaboration between startups and enterprise,
I see.
both in terms of the amount of funding that comes from CVC funds
Hmm.
and in startups go to market. So there's a lot of, so in the US, for example,
Yeah.
startups and enterprise are kind of natural enemies. Every startup wants to grow up to put the enterprise out of business and take their place, and that's what we do. Uh,
Right. Disrupt them. Yeah.
Disrupt them, exactly.
Right.
In Japan, yes, some are doing that, but most aren't. And in fact, because the brand power in Japan is so strong, a lot of startups, a big part of their go to market are these long-term
Mm.
partnerships with established brands.
Mm.
So it's, I don't think it's either good or bad. It
Hmm.
results in startups growing more slowly because they have to wait for
Right.
enterprise partners to like catch up to them and like drag them along.
Yeah.
But it allows for much more stable growth. So I think
Mm.
that's one really interesting and unique thing that I've only seen in Japan to this extent.
Interesting. So
Mhm.
creating synergy between big companies and
And
startups.
startups, yeah.
Yeah, I I see. So I guess also what's unique about Japan or Japanese startups is obviously the language. Here we have a big enough market. Some may argue, but well, a lot of people say that for example, Korean startups they need to look at the global stage because their market may not be good enough. I mean, big enough. But here in Japan, we have a
Yeah,
decent sized market, so they don't have to look at the international market. That may be the one reason why Japanese don't think globally.
I think
Do you
that's
agree?
true. Yeah, no, I mean that definitely is happening. A lot of Japanese startups are um, perfectly happy to focus on the Japanese market because it's safer, it's cheaper. But that's starting to change for a number of reasons. I think
Yeah.
Japanese founders, compared to say 10 years ago or even 5 years ago,
Yeah.
are much more internationally minded. I talk
Mm.
with far more founders today who say they are like global from day one,
Mm.
which is great.
Yeah,
And I think also the
definitely.
change we've seen in the venture capital
Right.
industry supports that. With more money available for late stage growth, with less
Right.
pressure to IPO quickly, um, it makes it easier to have global ambitions.
Mm,
But it's
mm,
it's not to the level it really should be. I think, despite the
mm.
progress we've seen, I think you're right. Japanese startups, Japanese founders need to be much more globally conscious and much
Yeah,
aware of potential competition coming from overseas.
yeah, yeah.
You know,
I happen to be, so go ahead.
oh no, I say China is a good example of that. So the
Mhm,
Chinese market is, what is bigger than the Japanese.
mhm.
Well, not in terms of GDP, but the kind of the addressable market that most startups are going after.
Right.
Um, but Chinese startups tend to be very, very international. They're very
Mm,
internationally minded, even though they have a huge domestic market that they can go after. So it's not
right,
just the size of the market. There's a real attitude shift as well.
right. It's the mindset. Maybe, have to do something with the risk averting, you know,
Yeah,
social mindset. Um, I don't know, but I happen to be in Europe right now, and I was talking to a few investors here, and asked them if they'd be interested in investing in Japanese startups, and they say, obviously, yes, if they are coming to Europe, and they can help them grow in Europe, yeah, they'll be interested. But if not, if they don't want to go globally, uh,
yeah, and I
they're not
think
gonna
that's a very
invest. Yeah,
fair
yeah,
response. That's a
right.
very fair response from a European or American VC.
Makes sense.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and,
Mm.
and most Japanese startups should be thinking about that, even if they're not ready for it
Right,
now. They should be thinking.
right, right. Yeah. And you've been interviewing, these entrepreneurs in Japan, in the last 9 years. Do you see any like differences, any more people, more entrepreneurs in Japan, like having more global mindset over the
Definitely. Yeah,
last
definitely.
years?
I
Yeah.
mean, it's definitely improved a lot, but I still
Hmm.
think it has to get better still. We're not
Mm.
quite where we need to be. And I mean, I think um it really is just mindset. So people talk
Yeah.
about education and language skills, and those are important for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Yeah.
if you look at, for example, Japanese industry in the 60s and 70s,
Yes.
the English level was far lower. The
Mm.
education system was even more strict.
Right.
But Japanese companies were incredibly innovative. They were incredibly globally
True.
minded. They
True.
they they understood what was happening in their industry everywhere in the world.
Mm. Mm.
So it's it's really a mindset more than anything else, I think.
Mm. Interesting. Like, yes, there were more Japanese people overseas outside of Japan, like 30, 40 years ago. And then
Right?
they were more global minded. Yeah. Although they didn't speak probably, like
Right,
the
right.
English back then.
So it's
That's
really a
true.
matter of mindset and priorities. And um, I think that we've seen a lot of progress over the last 5, 10 years.
Right.
I don't want to diminish the progress that has been made,
Right.
but I want to see the ecosystem get back to like the mindset that Japan had in the 60s and
Mm.
70s, where
The
right.
perfect topic. Yeah. How could we help realize that? How could we help motivate young Japanese entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs in general to go global? For example, I was teaching journalism at a college class a few years ago, and then I was asking uh, if they want to travel abroad. I was asking my students if they'd be interested in doing business or travel abroad, and they said. Not really, because I can, ever since I was born, one of the students were saying, ever since, I was born, I can go online and talk to people, outside of Japan. And I don't see the reason why I need to go abroad. And also uh, like the economy in Japan has been a downhill ever since I was born, and then so I'm kind of defensive.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
like, oh my God.
Oh, that makes me sad. But no, I see the same thing. And I don't know. I think the short answer, I mean, and I don't have the solution. If I did, I'd share it with the whole world. But
So
I think that the single most important thing
yeah,
is role models.
role
Um,
models.
if high school students, if university students look at successful entrepreneurs, and I don't
Mhm,
mean like the Mikitani sons or the Son sons, those are
mhm,
like too successful. I mean people who are maybe 5, 10 years older than they are,
mhm, mhm.
who've been successful overseas, who've had that experience. So they're more role models.
Yeah, yeah,
And then we can say, hey, well, look at these people.
right,
And someone like that, a university student, a high school student, is more like say, oh, well, they're kind of like me, right? They're just
right,
a little
right,
bit further along. I can do that.
right, 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 right.
And if I had to pick one thing that would help change minds, I think it is role models, really highlighting the people
Mm,
who are making these successful
mm,
businesses overseas, who are, and a lot of these founders, when they first decide to go overseas, their English isn't all that great.
mm.
It
Right,
really
right,
isn't, but they're like, I'm going to do this, and they learn,
right.
they get
Yeah,
better.
yeah, yeah.
It's about, it's startup mindset, right? If you don't know how to do it, you learn it.
Mm, mm, mm. A really good point and very inspiring. So they don't have to be the role models don't have to be superstar like rock star role models like Soma Sayoshi or Mikitani. It can be moderate like you know role models. Just they may be just around them.
Yeah, I think,
This
I mean, the Song sons, Mikitani sons are great. They're amazing to have in the ecosystem. But I think like your average university student, the gap is just so big, right?
right, right,
They
right.
can't look at that person and say, oh, I could do that.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
too
yeah, yeah.
much. It's too much. But
That's
if they
true.
see 4 or 5 successful entrepreneurs in their late 20s,
Hmm.
I think they'll say, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. He's
Right.
not that different than me. She's not that different from me.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think we
Among
need more role models.
yeah, among those you've interviewed, recently on Disrupting Japan podcast, can you think of some of those, role models that some entry level entrepreneurs could,
Well,
look after?
I'd say most of them are. I mean, I've had some very
Yeah.
famous people on the show as well, but most of my guests are people who just had an idea and went and did it.
Hmm.
People who've been on the show that have done market entry, or I mean, have gone global.
Yeah.
Hara-san from Sansan, Naka-san from Wantedly,
Hmm.
um, but also a lot of smaller companies, or Mujin, the robotics controller
Mm,
company. And these aren't
got you.
really huge, well, some of them are. Sansan's doing great, but I mean, most of them aren't really huge, famous success stories. But
Mm,
they're
mm.
they're good stories. They're small successes that are building into bigger successes. And I think that's what we
Right.
need to share.
I see. I see. I see. That's what we got to do too, right?
Yeah.
Tell and share their stories, and that encourages me too,
And it's a lot
and
of what you're
inspires me.
doing as well.
Yeah, yeah. So we kind of share the same goal, and I'm
We
so
do.
glad to be, partnering with you on content distribution and then yeah, and making content. So yeah, the startup, the role models are definitely something that we need, and also I guess we can talk about the ecosystem and some support from all corners, but especially the government is getting serious about increasing like startup investments finally in Japan, and I guess they've launched a 5-year plan. I think last year, and then this year, this fiscal year, the government will be doubling the amount of grants to startups. I think to 100 billion yen, which is a little short of 1 billion US dollars.
Right.
And they want to focus on investing in space tech, AI, and autonomous driving and stuff. That's what we are hearing. So yeah, so the money is coming in apparently. And so what's missing? What's next?
Well, so I think one of the most important things, so the government involvement in general is very interesting. So I think that if you compare like the US government involvement and Japan government involvement in startups.
Yeah.
So the US government is very, very involved in supporting startups,
Right.
but they're very
Right.
quiet about it. Silicon Valley was built on DARPA, US defense contracts and budgets. SpaceX
Yeah.
was basically a grant from NASA. I mean,
Mm.
but in the US, they like to kind of keep that quiet. They like to play in the background. In Japan, it's great that the government is investing more money and more resources into supporting startups. But maybe
Right.
more important than those resources is the kind of halo effect. When the government gets involved and takes a very visible role, it encourages larger companies, other companies to work with startups. It makes
Right.
startups seem more legitimate. It makes it easier for people to join startups, like socially easier to join startups.
Got
And I
you.
think right now that's one of the most important things that the government involvement is providing. I mean, the money's great too, don't get me wrong. But
Yeah,
I think that
of course.
social validation is also really important.
Definitely. Yeah. Yes. In terms of that, I guess Tokyo, the government of Tokyo, also has started its own initiatives in a very visible way, and they did their first city tech summit back in
Yes,
March. Yeah, and so the Tokyo government, not just the central government, the Tokyo state government also spent billions of
exactly.
dollars,
We're seeing
yen.
initiatives like that all over Japan. Fukuoka obviously has a lot of support for
Right.
startups, Kyoto as well. So really at every level, and even within Tokyo, the Shibuya government has its own startup
Right.
support. So it's like it really
That's
is
true.
at every level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's true. That's true. That's true.
it's great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
really
But
think
yeah.
that the social impact is bigger than the
Yeah.
monetary impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
But
in terms of what's missing, what you were asking, and that's such a great
yeah.
question. I think so. When I went back to San Francisco last year, first time after COVID,
Yeah.
what struck me as different as what was missing in Japan. So the Japanese, there's money here. Japanese founders are on a level of anywhere in the world in terms of knowledge, innovation, technical ability. But what really seems to be missing is that in San Francisco, there is this sense of urgency, this sense of we have to do it now.
I
And
see.
yeah, it's like, wow, they'd be a great customer. We got to call them today. If we grew 20% last quarter, awesome. We've got to do 25% growth this quarter. That urgency is missing in Japan, I feel.
That's a very interesting point.
Now some founders have that, but in general, the feeling in the ecosystem, I'd say that's the one thing really missing. The like, okay, great, do it now. Great idea, do it now.
Do it now.
Do it now.
That's right. That's a very good point. Yeah, I think that may apply to many situations in general in Japan, right? They
So
need to get
yeah.
permission. They need to talk to their bosses and the bosses of their bosses, and wait until let's wait and see kind of attitude, right?
Well,
I mean,
yeah, and at American big companies, yeah, there's a lot of the wait and
mm,
see. But American
mm,
startups, at least in San Francisco, no, do it now. What are you waiting for? Do
mm,
it now.
mm, mm. I see, I see. And interesting because yeah, you're talking about your, you know, the comparison between San Francisco and Tokyo, and I'm currently in Madrid, and I attended a big startup summit just last week. It's called South Summit, and I saw exactly what you're talking about, which is a really big like social involvement, and also on the government level, like there were government officials, ministers attending the event, and also the mayor of Madrid, and also a couple of celebrities, and um, even sports players, professional players. So it's a big event. I took a cab to the summit. Even the cab driver and knew, about the event, and
Yeah.
he said everybody in town is talking about the event.
Actually, I'm gonna give you one more thing I think is missing in
Sure.
Japan. And I don't know exactly how to fix this, but we need to figure out how to get it fixed. There is there needs to be a much better sense of community in Japan.
Mm,
And I don't mean events, the more events are always good, but a real sense of kind of pay it forward, make
mm,
introductions to each other, um, that type
right.
of, everyone helping each other
Mm,
needs to develop more in Japan. I've seen some place like Fukuoka has a good
mm-hmm,
sense of that kind of community.
mm, mm,
Kyoto also has a good sense of that kind of community.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, in Tokyo, Osaka, not really. There's tiny groups that are great and friendly and helpful, but as an ecosystem, that's
mm-hmm,
another thing we really need to improve. Just that
mm-hmm,
kind of pay it forward, uh,
mm-hmm,
everyone working together, bouncing ideas off each other type of
mm-hmm.
a community. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. I think we need to follow up on all these things, and then probably discuss further in our next video. We covered big subjects like having good role models, and then sense of urgency and community building, and mindset, and also the paying it forward kind of culture. And I think these all these elements are really really important, and probably we could as we help build the whole ecosystem to help entrepreneurs and the startup community here. uh, I think there's a lot of things that we could you know do, and looking into all these elements.
I think so too. And I mean, they're only going to get solved by people like you and me who are in the ecosystem standing up and doing things. No one, I mean,
Hmm.
that's the only way things happen. So yeah, I'd love to
Right,
continue this
right.
conversation
Yeah,
on another video or over a beer
yeah. let
or drinking a beer
Sounds
on
great.
another video.
Look forward to that. Thank you very much, Tim
Thanks so
Romero.
much.
And let's continue this discussion. Thank you so much, and good luck to you. And then we'll see you in the next video.
All right. Talk to you
Bye for
soon.
now.
Bye now.
Thank you.